It feels like there are a few interesting sort of paradoxes in public opinion to pull out in terms of how voters are feeling about this election and what they're picking up and what's influencing their vote. I think the first really interesting point is that this has probably rightly been described as the Brexit election. So when you ask people what's the #1 issue at the moment, they will parrot back at you without kind of pause for thought. Brexit, it's been the top of the Ipsos Mori's issue index for months. But actually, it's quite striking how little the parties are actually talking about Brexit and talking about the detail of what they're going to do and talk about the detail of what Brexit is going to look like. For most, it feels like a done deal. So there are a group of members of the public who we call devastated pessimists who will never get over Brexit and will never, ever, 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 ever come to terms with the result. But actually, we're looking at close to 2/3 now of the public who are either accepting of it and resigned to it and want, politicians to get on with it, or feel very positive about Brexit. But it feels very, very complicated. When you ask people what kind of Brexit they want, a hard Brexit or a soft Brexit, they really struggle to engage with the detail of that. And quite frankly, what they're looking for is to sort of defer responsibility for what kind of Brexit is best to Britain to someone they trust to deliver that Brexit. And this is why this is the Brexit election, but it's actually the leadership election. And the issue that matters above all else in this election is leadership and competence. And that, of course, really plays to Theresa May's strengths.
There seems to be so much at stake and actually really dramatic movements going on in politics. And yet the actual outcome of the June the 8th poll seems A, entirely predictable, and B, not necessarily to be able to change the course of these extraordinarily dramatic events that we're living through. The SNP, for example, even has problems when faced with Theresa May's Conservative Party, partly because of Ruth Davidson is such a good leader of the Scottish Conservatives, but also because in this atmosphere of voter fatigue and all the rest of it, deciding to focus early on promising a second independence referendum turned out to be an appalling tactical error. Then, what's happened to the Labour Party in recent years is the sort of terrible coming to pass of that statement by, I think it was Neil Kinnock when Ed Miliband was elected leader of the Labour Party, who said, "We've got our party back." Well, boy, has the left got their party back, and with disastrous results. And I think although it's very true that the Labour manifesto had some interesting things in it, the leaking, however it happened, gave them this strange boost of having the ideas discussed for a longer period than you would have expected, given the rest of the election campaign. And I think then there's the kind of disaster that is the Lib Dems. And one of the things that clearly happened in 2015 was that a lot of people moved across from being Lib Dem supporters through the coalition, which sort of detoxified the Tory party, and they're now Tory voters. And then here we are in an election where it looks as if the combined vote share of the two main parties could be up to kind of what it used to be in the 1970s almost, and all other players squeezed out. So it'd be really interesting to know whether this binary choice thing is the aberration, because it's a Brexit election, or whether the period of kind of nascent pluralism turns out to have been the aberration. So anyway, those are my thoughts about this really fascinating election that seems very dull day to day.
Without wanting to disregard the vote share, the fact remains under first past the post, the largest party coming out of Scotland is likely to be the SNP. I think most estimates for Tory seats in Scotland are around 5 or 6. I've heard 12, but that seems a bit excessive. Because of the way that votes are delivered under first past the post, the SNP will still be a sizable presence at Westminster. And there is a big debate going on about the idea of a progressive alliance. Scottish Labour absolutely hate the idea because they say the SNP are not progressive and they're not our allies. But some people do think that's the only way the Labour Party will be an effective force going forward. I think we will see a lot more cooperation between opposition parties on certain issues, especially around Brexit. That brings me to the second point, which is Labour's view on Brexit. And they have just about found a place that they can agree on in we accept Brexit, but we don't accept the willingness to turn our backs on the single market, and we want rights for EU citizens. I think if rights for EU citizens aren't immediately granted by the new Tory government, I think that will be an area that the opposition can rally around. Almost everyone's in agreement with that, including many people who voted Leave. I think the single market is a more difficult one for the left because some people are actually quite excited about the idea that we're free now of all the EU constraints on nationalisation. So I suspect it will be a dry debate, but it's one that will continue.
All elections, in a way, are historic. I think this one, although it seems dull, it has a big bearing on, the future of Britain. A landmark victory for May would mean a lot of things for different reasons. I mean, one which I think has been covered less is what it would mean for conservatism. For many Conservatives, Theresa May is quite left. And if you look at the lead so far, the reason the Tories are so high up is largely down to the collapse of the UKIP vote. So UKIP voters have gone to the Conservative Party, and that's why UKIP, I think some polls only have them on like 3%. And that means that Labour voters, for all the talk of how the Tories are going to win Labour voters, it hasn't happened yet. You might be getting some, but it's well they'll go for that. I have a friend who works for the BBC who was vox popping in a Labour heartland, and one voter, they asked him how he was going to vote, and he was like, well, I'm not going to vote for Jeremy Corbyn because he's just a bit weird. Don't like him on the television. I said, I'm not going to vote for the Tories because they're Tories, so why would I vote for them? So it's got to be Theresa May. The problem the Tories have in terms of how big the majority will be is what happens when voters like this voter get into the polling booth and they don't see Theresa May, they see Conservative. And I think that's the big challenge in terms of how landmark victory this would be.